The Monetary Policy Committee gets together.
I'm sure they're very entertaining meetings, actually.
I think they just roll dice.
I bet they finish it off in 5 minutes and then they talk about Venezuela. Or
of course they do. They probably don't even do that, do they? Probably, I don't know, they bring in local peasants and, use crossbows to shoot apples off their heads or something. This is the Pileus MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, my name's Christian Riley, and welcome to episode 3 of the Modern Monetary Theory podcast. Hopefully you listened to episodes 1 and 2 because they're ace. If not, spoiler alert, the upshot is that here in the UK, federal taxes don't fund federal government spending. Our government can spend whatever it wants on whatever it wants, and it doesn't use your tax money when it spends. When you pay your federal taxes, those pounds are literally deleted out of existence. Our government creates new pounds every time it spends. Other fiat currencies, like the US dollar or the Australian dollar, work the same way. This is why we can always go to war without checking a piggy bank. But don't you think it's weird that no sooner have our politicians voted to spend lots of money on all kinds of things that much of the electorate oppose, than they start trying to get us very worried about the government budget deficit? Why are they always talking about the government debt? Maybe you're starting to catch on to the fact that the more pounds issued by the issuers of our currency, that's the government, means that there are more pounds in existence for the users of the currency. That's you and me. So what's the problem with the government running a deficit? You guessed it, there's no problem. The deficit's nothing to be scared of, and like a lot of things, it's being used as a political football. Me and my co-host Patricia would like to kick that political football into touch by talking about how government actually spends, so that you, me, we the people can get back to falling out about actual substantive political issues instead of worrying about the government running out of money. In this episode, among other things, if the government can't run out of money, why does it sell government bonds? Let's jump in. I think we want to talk about this question that always comes up whenever you want to advocate for a progressive policy. And that question that always comes up is, how are you going to pay for that?
Yes, but it's frustrating that it never comes up when, you talk about policies pursued by conservative governments or right-wing governments, especially, or more recently, the Syria airstrikes, for example. Yes,
they didn't need to check their bank account to see whether they could afford the missiles that they sent over there.
It's not just that one, but also the tax cuts for that Trump usually passed through Congress in the US as well. Not a peep about cost. I think that actually came from the Democrats tried to make a point about the cost of the tax cuts, but that was a very bad idea for reasons that we're about to explain.
The Democrats and neoliberals all over the world are deficit trolls. They're very right?
No, that's a good term, because they usually call deficit hawks, aren't they? But I think that gives them that makes them sound a little bit too glamorous.
Exactly. So, it sounds like some noble bird of prey.
Deficit troll. We should have an image of that.
Yeah. They're deficit trolls. They're very, very bothered about the deficit when it's funding things that they want to cut, and then once that's been cut, they forget that the deficit is actually the money in everybody's pockets.
But if you think about it as well, the last election you had. That kind of double standards was pretty evident from the way that the campaign went on both camps. The media was very forgiving of the Conservatives, not costing any of their policies, but it wasn't very forgiving of Labour whenever it tries to pass any policy at all.
There's an extra thing going on with UK Labour at the moment, which is there's an actual left-wing leader in charge of Labour. So you have to suspend all the normal rules of warfare and attack the character of that person, attack the things they've liked on Facebook, attack they have to attack everything, and so different rules are applying for this particular ideological war.
Yes, but Labour did, in my opinion, unnecessarily go through the trouble of costing every single one of their policies in a kind of an effort to create credibility. Because sadly, that's what people at the moment find credible, right? We're still operating under the perception that the government spending is like household spending. So just like a household, government has to cost every one of their proposals and match it with a tax.
If you've been paying attention to our podcast, we'll say it one more time. Our government spending is nothing like your household spending. The government can spend whatever it wants as long as it's priced in pounds. The government is the monopoly issuer of pounds. It cannot run out of pounds. That's not the issue. That's not why things have to be costed.
Yeah, and it's used as this kind of how are you going to pay for it question. It's used as a weapon against any government, mostly, and it tends to be left-wing governments that try to increase. It's only used for social spending. It's never used for war. It's never used for tax cuts to corporations. It's only used for social programs.
That's right. So if you've been paying attention to our podcast, and you can go back and listen to the last two we did, this is number 3, we've talked about why taxes don't fund spending. So if you're having trouble with that, go back and listen to the last 2 episodes, particularly episode 2. Taxes don't fund spending. So
we started explaining that every expenditure by government was new money, effectively. So the idea, costing something, saying that you have to raise income before you're spending is immediately a fallacy. You don't. The money is there because the government has the power to create money. So before, I know a lot of people at the moment are going to start shouting inflation and fair enough, but there is, that's a separate consideration. The matter of fact is government can create money as it spends.
It can create money, and it can control inflation. If there are too many pounds chasing too few goods and services, you'll see inflation. At the moment, we have a lot of idle resources in this country, unemployed people looking for work. If they're all employed and we have zero unemployment and we still create money to employ people, that's when you'll see inflation. But at the moment, the economy is not at capacity.
There are many types of inflation as well, but the right usually talks about inflation only when it comes to government spending, and they blame. To be honest, everything is blamed on government spending.
Yeah, I've got a theory about why that happened. I think the reason that, and I wouldn't limit it to the right. We've had many people who consider themselves left of centre.
The Lib Dems do worry a lot about inflation.
Exactly,
as well.
It's in our entire culture now, in our entire political dialogue now, to worry about inflation. It's a way to get taken seriously as a politician. So, and it's because you, the listener, our friends, don't know, or people that don't know that that's not how inflation works. So politicians have to talk like that's how inflation works. That's the problem. That's why we're doing this podcast. So even though people know that taxes don't fund spending, economists know it, even though we know that the government can afford to buy anything priced in pounds without limit, because you don't know that, because you understand household metaphors like your household budget, they have to put things in those terms because the population doesn't know that. Yeah. And So that's what we're about trying to change. So we've talked about taxes not funding spending, and we've talked about that the government can afford whatever it wants to buy, as long as it's priced in pounds, and as long as it exists. A question that comes up for people who've been paying attention to those things is, well, I thought the government had to borrow money. I thought they had to sell bonds to cover what they don't get in taxes.
Why does an entity that can create money at will need to borrow money from the private sector, which cannot create currency?
The reason the government are selling bonds and buying bonds and conducting what they call open market operations is to control the interest rate, the cost of borrowing. The Bank of England is charged with monetary policy. It's not charged with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy would be what the government are going to spend money on. There's a monetary policy committee that get together. That's a subdivision of the Bank of England. Am I right?
Is that its name? I have no idea.
Yeah, I think something like that. And it's about half a dozen or 14 people, and they get together and decide what the interest rate's going to be, whether they're going to lower it or raise it by a very small fraction of a percentage point.
The Bank of England doesn't control the amount of credit that's created, but what the Bank of England does is control the cost of borrowing this money, the cost of credit creation, and that is interest rates.
They set the interest rate. So there is a distinction between the Bank of England, which is our central bank, and all the other banks are commercial banks, and they bank at the Bank of England. So the Monetary Policy Committee gets together.
You're right, that's his name.
Oh,
I just checked.
I love being right. It's great. So they get together, and
I'm sure they're very entertaining meetings, actually.
Well, I don't know how long. It's their entire job as well, isn't it? Just like, what do you think? I mean, I think they just roll dice.
I bet they finish it off in 5 minutes, and then they talk about Venezuela. Or
of course they do. Well, they probably don't even do that, do they? Probably, I don't know. They bring in local peasants and use crossbows to shoot apples off their heads or something. Surely that's what they do, because who knows, but they decide whether they're going to make this tiny adjustment to the interest rate. They're deciding what's going to happen in the economy by changing this one number, this interest rate, by a fraction. And once it's been decided upon, then the fun and games start for the central bank. And by fun and games, don't get excited.
Do get excited. It's very exciting.
They have to. Jump in. Patricia's just taken a massive sip of wine there just to get through
it's
this.
Water.
Sorry, it's when the Bank of England is instructed to credit a bank account, because that's how all the government spending works, reserves are added. Reserves are added system-wide.
The Bank of England kind of backs up the whole financial system in this country, so that when you go to take out cash off the cash machine, the cash machine always has cash available for you to take out, and you can always transfer your money out to another bank. It keeps it running effectively. So in order to do that, the bank has to make sure that the banks have enough cash readily available. Think about it as a kind of easy access savings accounts, which would be the reserves. But at the same time, if the banks have too many reserves, then the rate at which the banks lend to each other it drops quite a lot, and the interest rate drops a lot. And the Bank of England tries to control this interest rate, because that interest rate also dictates the interest rates at which the banks operate and lend out.
It influences the interest
rates as well. So it's in the interest of the Bank of England that if the banks have too many reserves, they convert some of those reserves into more less liquid form of savings account, which are the bonds.
How about we say it this way? At your bank, dear listener, at your bank, you have savings accounts and a current account. And at the Bank of England, they have a savings account and a current account. Their savings account is bonds, and their current account is called a reserve account. When bonds are bought, all that's happening is the pounds that are in current accounts are moving to the savings account at the Bank of England. It doesn't really change a whole lot. So quantitative easing didn't change a whole lot because that's all that happened.
I think most people think of quantitative easing as like they think it's the Bank of England is injecting money into the economy, but it's not really. I mean, that money is already owned by the banks. It's just in simply two different types of savings accounts. One is a savings account, like we said, and the other one would be the reserves or current account, like we said. So it's simply changing the balance from the savings account to the current account. It doesn't really add anything it doesn't increase the money supply.
I think the thinking behind it was that they wanted to make it easier for banks to lend.
Yeah, but it doesn't work.
It doesn't work because that's not what makes banks lend. What makes banks lend is demand. People who want to take out loans. The banks have the liquidity to lend anytime. It's not, their reserve account isn't a limiting factor for a commercial bank giving you a loan. The limiting factor is just whether there are people that want to borrow.
Obviously, when we had the 2008 financial crisis, the banks weren't. They laxed a little bit, when we talk about subprime mortgages and things like that. They laxed a little bit in their ability to, not a little bit, a lot, in their ability to tell or to assess whether a customer was able to repay the debt. And the reason why they laxed was because the government put less and less stringent regulations upon them.
There was such a thing as ninja loans, or no income, no job, no problem.
God,
yeah, it had gotten to that point.
I do think that the lending criteria in banks has become more stringent when it comes to mortgages.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's rules for us, the public. It's different if you're actually a financial insider or a financial institution.
Yeah.
Those institutions got financially incentivized to take bigger risks because they have this insurance policy called too big to fail. It's literally been tested. It was tested in 2008, and it turns out they're too big to fail. So they'll be speculating in risky ways in years to come.
It is government regulation which, in a way, restricts the amount of credit that the banks can issue. At the moment, the criteria has been tightened with mortgages, but for example, we're seeing a rise in lending for car loans and other types of what we call unsecured lending, and so banks find obviously that the path of least resistance to try and increase the lending there. So when the Bank of England says, I'm going to do QE so that banks lend more, it won't change anything because banks are already lending as much as they can. They're lending as much as people can borrow. So during QE, the Bank of England bought a hell of a lot of bonds, which basically just means that you transfer the bank's balance from the savings accounts to the current account.
It changed.
Into their books.
It changed columns.
It changed columns.
Some numbers changed columns.
It's like an Excel spreadsheet. I think it's actually an Excel spreadsheet.
Just to recap, though, what we are saying, though, is those bonds have not been sold in order to finance government spending. That's not why the Bank of England sell bonds. I hope in this whole time you've been listening, that's the impression you've got, because that's not what's happening. Bonds do not finance government spending in any way. So
perhaps the term borrowing, when used in government spending, is a little bit confusing.
I think it's completely misleading, and it's not appropriate now to call it borrowing. it probably was back when we were on a gold standard. You would have to borrow what you couldn't get through taxation, I guess. But there's really no point talking about the gold standard.
Oh God, let's not get into that.
Well, there's just no point because it's not the system. It's nobody uses it. It's not an effective way forward.
A lot of the ills, a lot of the confusion amongst economists and amongst educated people with regards to how the economy works is an inability to realize that the rules that used to apply when you had the gold standard no longer applies when you don't have a gold standard.
Yeah, it is possible for us, the private sector, to default. We could overextend ourselves and default.
Yeah.
It's not a problem for the government. The government can't default in its own currency because, as we keep saying, the government is the monopoly issuer of pounds. It cannot default in pounds. When the bonds mature and the payments become due on the bonds and they're due in pounds, the government cannot default on those payments. So
the bonds are savings accounts, effectively, that the Bank of England is uses in banks to control the interest rate of banks. The government can always pay the interest on the bonds, which it also creates from thin air. Money is created from thin air to pay the interest on the bonds. But the point is that it didn't have to issue the bonds in the first place. There is no need to issue bonds when it comes to simply trying to cover for the difference or trying to account for the difference between taxation and spending. No, it's just not what the bonds are being issued for. The bonds are being issued to control interest rates, and that's it. And if the Bank of England didn't intervene, the interest rate would fall to zero. The result of no intervention is a zero interest rate, which is what a lot of MMTers advocate, zero interest rate policy, or ZIRP. And therefore, which we'll explain in another episode, in another time. But it would again be like, let's get back to what people think of as capitalism, which is, you go out and make your investments if you want your idle money to grow into more money. If you talk about the Second World War, you see the posters from back then, and you had buy government bonds today. And people have been taught, have learned to see these posters, have understood them to be the means whereby government obtained funds to fund the war. When in fact, what the government was doing was incentivizing savings. And by incentivizing savings, it could dedicate more of its resources to the war, because if people are saving, it means that they're not consuming. And when you're not consuming, you don't need to dedicate as many productive resources for general consumption. And Britain needed to do that because it needed all of its productive resources to the war effort. It needed the soldiers that used to be, before the war, the big part of their workforce was now in the army. And also it needed to feed the soldiers, it needed to produce weapons to keep on supporting the war effort. That's not to say that the government did not have pounds to spend. It did have pounds to spend, it just needed people to save. If it just had not encouraged this, then inflation might have picked up, because people would have been consuming too much and the demand for goods and services would have gone up. And as we know, as so many productive resources were dedicated to the war, then there wouldn't have been enough. I believe there was a blockade on Britain at the time. That's what rationing was about. It was about controlling inflation. I don't know at this point, were we on the gold standard as well? No, you abandoned it for the war. Oh, did I? Well, yeah. I'm glad I did. I say you because at that time I wasn't British. Okay. No, neither was I. I didn't exist. I mean, I don't know where. God, I'd hate to, maybe I was on the other side in a previous life before I was reincarnated. I inherited all of Britain's history about 2 years ago when I became British. Well, congratulations. Thank you. I hope you feel suitably awkward. Yeah, I've been learning about it, and I'm not sure now, actually.
Well, yeah. Well, do you know what? That makes you so British.
Yeah, I've realised that.
The not being sure, the constant questioning.
But yes, the gold standard was abandoned during the World War II, and
yeah, because it wasn't working.
If we had been in the gold standard in World War II, we would have lost the war. As easy as that.
The spending would have been limited to the amount of gold that you could get off people. The whole war effort would be about finding gold instead of putting soldiers in the field.
When Britain was at war, immediately it did whatever it needed to do to win that war. And it abandoned all known propriety about currencies in order to do that. There's a famous quote by Tony Benn. It's an interview he had with the director of Sicko, Michael Moore. Yeah, and in this, I remember this interview very well because it kind of shows the kind of reasoning that led to the big investment that Britain saw after the war, the creation of the NHS, the welfare state, etc. And they had massive unemployment after the war, but they didn't have unemployment during the war. So Tony Benn says, if it was possible to have full employment, killing Germans or going to war, why isn't it possible to have full employment, hiring nurses, recruiting teachers, building schools, etc. And it's this mentality that once you go to war, you do whatever you need to do. It's only when it comes to public services, to social programs, that suddenly everybody becomes really stingy.
Yeah, it's fair to say we can only imagine what post-World War II Britain felt like. Mm-hmm. But I remember that quote from Tony Benn. He said people had seen that they could have full employment for war when we're killing each other. So what's to stop us having full employment in peacetime? And I think what he meant by that was people had seen with their own eyes that governments can employ everybody. Let's have that again. But instead of tearing down, instead of having to defend, instead of being at war, we can be building up. We can build a thing like the National Health Service. And I think that went a long way. The memory of the war and the memory of the full employment and everybody pulling together, and that all came together to raise consciousness to a level where they understood, like your average person could understand, yeah, we can have this. Mm-hmm. And I think the further we've got away in time from that, the people who don't like the idea of the NHS on ideological grounds have grown in number, and it's been under ideological attack since its inception. The welfare state has been under ideological attack since its inception. So any weapon they can use to tear that down or privatize parts of it, because they don't want to privatize the whole thing, because where would they get their profits from if there wasn't a government teat injected in there somewhere?
Yeah.
But it's basically the privatization game is about trying to get public money into private firms and private pockets. So
that mentality, Tony Benn describes is effectively the kind of mentality which led to a period that we now know as the Great Prosperity.
The golden age of capitalism.
Yes, and it is still capitalism, but it is the recognition that government investment was at the heart of the prosperity of a nation. The foundation was public services, and it's from the 1950s all the way to the 1980s.
Yeah,
you can guess what happened then.
Well, we could say Thatcher happened, and it was something to do with
and Reagan happened.
And the force of their personalities. But I'm going to say another thing. I think they came along at a time when people had lost faith in the way things were, because there was this oil price shock in the early 70s that led to a massive inflation. The OPEC nations restricting the supply of oil in the early 70s, that led to the price of oil skyrocketing. Because everything needs transporting, that price shock went through every manner of goods and services that were being produced and consumed globally.
The Keynesians understood many things about the economy. They got a lot of things right. It led to a period of great prosperity, as we were saying. But something that they didn't have quite right was understanding inflation when it was caused by supply side issues. And it was very easy for the neoliberals to come in, capitalize on the confusion to say that it was caused by government spending. And the Keynesians really didn't have any answers at this point. And you can also start seeing kind of the paranoia about where the paranoia against inflation comes from this kind of event, this big event that changed, marked the end of the Great Prosperity era.
Yeah, and it lives on today, this paranoia about, not paranoia, a concern about inflation. Our current Labour Party, our opposition, has a rule, what's it called? Fiscal rule?
Fiscal credibility rule.
This is what they've put together to try and reassure people, because they're more authentically left-wing and worker-orientated than any time in my lifetime since they lost power to Thatcher, I would say. So naturally, they have to play politics, and I think they've come up with this document about, look, we're not going to spend, quote unquote, irresponsibly, and this is what we're committing to. And
I have a problem with that word of responsibility.
Me too. That's why I put it in quotes. Because you and I, Patricia, we think it's irresponsible for the government not to spend for full employment. Because Correct. The pathologies that go along with unemployment, the really, people literally die. And, underfunded public services lead to people dying and having, very uncomfortable lives. And it's so wasteful. So that's why I put responsibility in quotes. Because if you're a voter and you've never been touched by any of these issues, you will get panicked by somebody saying that, our national debt is some astronomical figure. They will get you to focus on a number in isolation and go, isn't that a big number? And, you'll go, yes, it is. I mean, if it was cheap, I wouldn't like to count them. But it's not. It's just, it's a decontextualized number that's meaningless without context.
Fiscal responsibility, I think it's a term that has been tarnished because it's associated with costing everything, and by costing means matching all government spending with taxation, minimizing government debt, because apparently government debt is a bad thing. When did we decide that government debt was a bad thing? It was when the focus changed from full employment to prioritizing inflation and
opponents of anybody that would like our NHS to be better resourced really haven't squandered the opportunity that came along in 2008 when everybody started talking about deficits and debt, and there was I
don't think anybody understood it then.
No, exactly, and they took advantage of the fact that they didn't understand it, and all the news bulletins kept telling the public, we've spent too much money, and there's none left. And I don't know, I checked my bank statement. It wasn't me. I hadn't spent too much money.
Remember David Cameron walking around with that note from, was it the Labour Bank of England governor?
I don't know if I've
that we have no money.
I endeavour never to remember David Cameron. That's one of my missions in life. So to get back to Labour's fiscal credibility rule, again, I think Labour are having to speak the language of politics as it is now. It's not their job to educate people, to get them thinking differently about
I disagree on that. I think it is the job of politicians to educate people, because when we had the 2015 election and the Tories, when you had Gordon Brown, when you had David Cameron holding that letter from Liam Byrne saying, "I'm afraid there is no money, look," and showing it as proof to the electorate that there was no money, that was education. That, in a sense, is a type of education, is a very malicious type of education in my view, but it is an education. He's trying to put a case forward.
That wasn't education. That was the politician at that time working with the mindset that people already had. So it's like that mindset is a free lunch to these people. They don't have to do any work to get them there.
The household analogy is a form of education.
Yes,
it's a very bad form of education.
Yeah.
But you saw the Conservatives using the household analogy over and over and over.
Yeah.
And I think Labour needs to find its own analogies.
But they don't have to do any work to get people to think that way. It wasn't like people were understood currency and how governments spend, and then Thatcher said that, and then all of a sudden they were thinking about households.
I think it's about language.
Yeah, once they're in that mindset, if the opponent doesn't adopt that mindset or doesn't adopt that language, they're at risk of not being taken seriously. So if you look at, say, Bernie Sanders in the States, he had Stephanie Kelton as his advisor, who is a MMT goddess advising him. If he'd have stood there and said, "No, the government can't run out of dollars, so that's how we're going to fund Medicare for all," Hillary would have just gone, "See, he's bonkers. Of course the government can run out of money. You can run out of money. I can run out of money. Vote for me. Don't vote for him." And that's on his own side. So I think that's why politicians end up having to play politics.
But Bernie will have, for example, changed his language in order to, at the very least, stop reinforcing certain ideas about the economy.
Yes.
There is a lot of confusion out there with regards to the language that we use. When we say government is borrowing, immediately there are parallels between household borrowing, and that doesn't help people understand our economy at all.
Let's just put an axe straight through that. It's not borrowing.
It's not borrowing. It's issuing bonds. We say issuing bonds here.
The government have told the Bank of England to control interest rates, and that was a rule set some years ago that the Bank of England was going to be independent and conduct monetary policy, which is literally setting interest rates. So that's their job, the Bank of England, and I'm sure that the government devolved that power to the Bank of England so that they could go, "It's not us, it's the Bank of England," so they don't get voted out of office when the economy's bad. The people associated with this bad economy then have to come up with other reasons for why the economy's bad. We've been working with Thatcherism since the 80s, so the people who don't want to blame capitalism itself are now going, "Well, we must be doing capitalism wrong," and then they go, "It's the government. The government's too big. The government's too."
What a convenient reality!
And in order for them to, the government's gotten in the way. And guess what can constrain the government? The gold standard. That's why we need to get back on it and stop them being able to spend whatever they want and taking over our lives.
We should have an episode on the gold standard as well.
Well, I mean, there's nothing to say about it apart from why Why would you want to have a rule? I mean, after Warren Mosler says, well, yeah, we could make all kinds of silly rules about how we spend. We could all make a rule that we all have to stand on one foot.
Yeah, the foot standard.
That was the Pileus MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. You can get in touch with us via Twitter. Patricia is at Patricia N. Pino, and I'm Christ Riley. You can also email me at christriley@outlook.com. I'm going to spell those for you. Patricia is at PatricianPino, and I'm at ChristReilly. We hope to hear from you, and we hope you can tune in next week. Thanks for listening. too many pounds chasing too many goods and services.
Too few goods.
Sorry. Thank God you're here. Let's start over.